Night found Henry on a deserted road. The forest stretched on endlessly. The dark silhouettes of the trees swayed in the cold wind. The road he was walking along had long since turned into a barely noticeable path. He hoped to reach the nearest village before dark, but the sun had already disappeared behind the horizon, and impenetrable darkness reigned all around. He had been walking for many hours. His legs were buzzing from fatigue. His stomach was cramping from hunger, and more than anything in the world, he wanted at least a little rest. And then he saw a tree. It stood right by the road, massive, crooked, with a thick trunk covered in deep cracks. The branches stretched into the sky, resembling black, bony fingers. There were almost no leaves on it, but the roots, on the contrary, looked as if they were greedily growing, making their way underground, crawling out to the surface, twisting into terrible knots. Henry remembered the stories he had heard in the last town about the cursed tree. They said that no one should stay under its shade. It was ancient, too ancient, and its roots went deeper than anyone could imagine. Travelers who dared to spend the night under it disappeared. Henry chuckled. Stupid stories. He was tired. His legs were weak and his eyes were sticking together. How could anything happen if he just sat down for a few hours until dawn? Laughing at his own suspiciousness, he leaned his back against the rough bark, pulled up his hood, and closed his eyes. But as soon as he fell asleep, the tree began to move. Henry woke up from a strange sound. Sleep had not yet completely left him, but his consciousness had already begun to discern something around him. Whispers. Quiet, barely perceptible, as if the wind was making its way through empty branches. But there was no wind. He slowly opened his eyes. The forest was completely dark. There was no moon, no stars, only impenetrable darkness, seeming to thicken right above him. The whisper was repeated. It sounded closer now. The voice, almost gentle, came from the trunk of the tree. Henry. He jerked. His heart stopped. The whisper sounded as if the tree knew his name. It was impossible. He turned sharply, peering into the bark, but saw nothing. Cracks in the wood, thick, gnarled roots going into the ground. Everything was as before. And then something moved. Silhouettes appeared at the edge of the clearing, where the night intertwined with the darkness of the forest. Dark, elongated, faceless. They didn't move, just stood between the tree trunks surrounding him. Henry swallowed. "Who's there?" His voice was too quiet, as if something was suppressing it. The figures didn't answer. But the tree whispered again. "Henry, why did you come?" The sounds came from inside, from deep within. And suddenly he realized those cracks in the bark weren't just cracks. They were mouths. Small, stretched out. They moved, whispering his name. Henry jumped to his feet. The whispers grew louder. They were voices now. Dozens, hundreds of voices. They said his name over and over, merging into a low, oppressive hum. He took a step back. The figures began to stir. They were no longer standing still. Their bodies swayed slightly, but they did not move, as if they were waiting. Henry began to run, but the roots were already moving under his feet. Henry tried to run. He rushed forward, but the roots, writhing, entangled his legs, pulled him down. The ground beneath him became soft, yielding, as if nature itself had decided to swallow him. He screamed, tore himself away, but the more he resisted, the deeper he sank into the dark, damp soil. The withered figure that had emerged from the trunk now stood right in front of him. Its features were blurred, but Henry saw what he feared to see most. Her face was his face, rotten, distorted, with empty eye sockets. But it belonged to him. "You're one of us," the voice whispered, and the shadow extended a hand. A freezing cold enveloped his body. Henry took his last breath, and then the tree took him. The next morning, the road was empty again. The tree stood in its place, its long, gnarled branches spreading out. No one could tell that anyone had been there the night before. But a new crack had appeared in its trunk, and if a traveler dared to pass by in silence, he could hear a whisper. Henry, Henry. The tree was calling for a new victim.